Hi, and welcome to English-Fabule. Are you learning English? Great. Let's learn English with a very interesting story. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment. Let's get started.
The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, is a group of countries in North America and Europe. It was created in 1949 after the Second World War. The main reason for forming NATO was to provide security for its members. At that time, there was concern about the Soviet Union and its influence in Europe. NATO was designed as a way for countries to work together to protect themselves from possible threats. NATO is based on an agreement called the North Atlantic Treaty. This treaty includes Article 5. Article 5 is very important because it says that if one NATO country is attacked, all other NATO countries will consider it as an attack against themselves. This means they will help the country that was attacked. This idea is called collective defense. Over time, NATO has grown and changed. More countries have joined, and NATO's role has expanded beyond just defense. It now works on different security issues around the world. NATO is seen by many as a key part of global security. It provides a forum for countries to discuss problems and work together on solutions. However, there have been questions about the future of NATO. One important question is the role of the United States. The U.S. has been a leader in NATO since its beginning, but some people have suggested that the U.S. might reduce its involvement in the alliance. For example, former U.S. President Donald Trump expressed his opinion that the U.S. might not always defend NATO countries if they did not spend enough money on their own defense. This idea has raised discussions about the strength and future of NATO. The question of U.S. commitment to NATO is important. NATO plays a significant role in international security. Changes in its structure or the involvement of key members like the U.S. could have big effects on world affairs. Understanding NATO, its history, how it works, and the different views about its future is important in today's world. 2. NATO's start and growth. After the Second World War, many countries in Europe were weak. There was also a new worry: the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was a very large and powerful country with a different political system. Some countries in Western Europe and North America felt they needed to work together for safety. In 1949, 12 countries created the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. These original members were Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, the United Kingdom, and the United States. NATO's first main goal was to protect its members from the Soviet Union. This was during the Cold War, a period of tension between the West and the Soviet bloc. NATO was based on an idea of collective defense. This means that if one NATO country is attacked, all other members will help to defend it. This idea is written in Article 5 of the NATO Treaty. Over time, more countries joined NATO. In 1952, Greece and Turkey became members. West Germany joined in 1955, and Spain in 1982. After the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union broke apart in the early 1990s, the situation in Europe changed. Many countries in Eastern Europe, which were previously in the Warsaw Pact, a group led by the Soviet Union, wanted to join NATO. Starting in 1999, NATO expanded to include these countries. Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic joined first. Later, in 2004, Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia also became members. Albania and Croatia joined in 2009, Montenegro in 2017, North Macedonia in 2020, Finland in 2023, and Sweden in 2024. NATO's mission also changed over time. At first, it was mainly about defending against a large attack from the Soviet Union. But after the Cold War, NATO started to take on broader roles. It became involved in managing crises and keeping peace in different parts of the world. For example, NATO took action in the Balkans in the 1990s and later led operations in Afghanistan after the attacks of the 11th of September, 2001. Article 5. The collective defense principle was used for the first time after these attacks, showing NATO's commitment to mutual support even in new kinds of security challenges. So, NATO grew from a small group of nations focused on one main threat to a larger alliance with a wider range of missions in a changing world. 3. How NATO works. NATO is a big organization with many parts. It has a structure to help member countries work together for security. There are two main parts: civilian and military. The main decision-making body in NATO is the North Atlantic Council, or NAC. Think of it like a meeting room where all member countries come together. Each country has a representative in the NAC. Important decisions about NATO are made here. Decisions are made by consensus. This means all countries must agree before NATO takes action. The NAC meets regularly to discuss problems and plan what NATO should do. The Secretary General is like the leader of NATO. They're the main spokesperson and chair the meetings of the North Atlantic Council. The Secretary General helps to guide discussions and make sure NATO works effectively. NATO also has a military structure. This structure helps member countries' armies work together. The Military Committee is made up of the top military leaders from each country. They give advice to the NAC on military matters. There are two main military commands: Allied Command Operations, ACO, and Allied Command Transformation, ACT. ACO is responsible for NATO's military operations around the world. ACT focuses on making NATO forces better for the future through training and new ideas. A very important part of NATO is Article 5. This is about collective defense. It means that if one NATO country is attacked, all other NATO countries will help. It is like saying an attack on one is an attack on all. Article 5 has only been used once. This was after the attacks on the United States on the 11th of September, 2001. After these attacks, NATO countries agreed to help the USA. To run NATO, money is needed. Member countries contribute money to NATO. There are common funds for things like running the headquarters. Countries also pay for their own militaries. NATO has a target for how much money member countries should spend on defense. This target is 2% of a country's GDP total wealth. The idea is that if countries spend enough on defense, NATO will be stronger and better able to protect its members. Not all countries reach this 2% target, but NATO encourages them to work towards it. In summary, NATO works through different parts: political discussions in the NAC, leadership from the Secretary General, military planning through the Military Committee and Commands, and the important promise of collective defense in Article 5. All of this is supported by money and resources from member countries with a goal of strong collective security. 4. The USA in NATO. The United States was a founding member of NATO in 1949. It has been a very important country in the alliance since the beginning. The USA has played a leading role in NATO. This means it has had a big influence on NATO's direction and decisions. The USA provides a lot of military support to NATO. American soldiers, ships, and planes are part of NATO's forces. The U.S. military presence in Europe is significant. It shows the U.S. commitment to the defense of Europe and NATO. This military strength is important for NATO's collective security. Financially, the United States is also a major contributor. It has the largest economy among NATO members. The USA spends more money on defense than any other country in NATO. NATO members discuss burden sharing. This means sharing the costs of defense. There is a guideline for members to spend 2% of their GDP on defense. The USA has often spent more than this and encourages other members to increase their spending. U.S. views on NATO have changed over time with different presidents. Most presidents have seen NATO as important for U.S. and European security. However, there have been discussions about fair contributions from all members. President Trump expressed different views on NATO. He questioned if all NATO members were paying enough. He suggested the U.S. might not defend countries that did not meet the 2% spending target. He raised concerns about whether other NATO countries would defend the U.S. if needed, despite Article 5. It's important to note that Article 5, NATO's Collective Defense Clause, was activated once by NATO in support of the USA after the attacks of the 11th of September, 2001. The idea of burden sharing is a key issue in U.S.-NATO relations. The U.S. has consistently asked European allies to take more responsibility for their defense spending. President Trump's comments increased attention on this issue. NATO Secretary General has stated that more NATO countries are now increasing their defense budgets towards the 2% target, partly due to the discussions about burden sharing. In conclusion, the USA is a central and powerful member of NATO. It has been a leader since NATO's creation, providing significant military and financial resources. Discussions about how to share defense responsibilities within NATO continue to shape the relationship between the U.S. and the alliance. The U.S. role and perspective remain very important for NATO's strength and its future in global security. 5. Problems inside NATO. NATO is a group of countries working together for defense, but sometimes there are problems inside NATO. These problems are often about different ideas and what each country wants. One big problem is money for defense. NATO asks each country to spend 2% of its money on defense. However, not all countries do this. Some countries spend more, and some spend less. This can cause arguments. Some countries, like the United States, say that other countries should pay more. They think it is not fair when some countries do not pay their share. This is called burden sharing. Some leaders have said that if countries do not pay enough, the U.S. might not defend them. Another problem is what countries think is important. Some countries might see one country or problem as a big threat. Other NATO countries might not agree. For example, some countries might be very worried about Russia. Other countries might be more worried about problems in other parts of the world, like terrorism. When countries have different ideas about dangers, it can be hard to agree on what NATO should do. Sometimes, things happen in the world that create tension inside NATO. For example, the war in Iraq caused disagreements between NATO members. More recently, events like Russia taking Crimea and the war in Ukraine have also tested NATO unity. These events can show different opinions on how NATO should react to world problems. Turkey is a NATO country, but its relationship with other NATO members is sometimes difficult. Turkey has its own interests and sometimes acts in ways that other NATO countries do not agree with. This can create problems and discussions inside NATO. Even though there are these problems, NATO countries still work together. They talk and try to find solutions. They remember that they have a promise to defend each other if attacked. This promise is very important for all NATO members, but it is also important to know that inside NATO, like in any group of countries, There are always discussions and different points of view. These discussions are a normal part of how NATO works and tries to stay strong. 6. Arguments for U.S. leaving. Some people suggest that the United States could consider leaving or reducing its role in NATO. They have different reasons for this idea. One main point is about money. The U.S. spends a lot of money on defense, and a significant part of this goes to supporting NATO. Some argue that this is too much. They say that other NATO countries in Europe should spend more on their own defense. It is mentioned that many NATO countries do not meet the agreed target of spending 2% of their GDP on defense. If these countries are not paying their share, some argue that the U.S. should not have to pay so much to protect them. The idea is that European countries are rich and capable enough to take more responsibility for their own security. Another argument is about the U.S. military. Maintaining a strong military presence in Europe is expensive for the United States. Resources used for NATO could potentially be used for other U.S. priorities, like domestic issues or challenges in other parts of the world, such as Asia. Some believe that the U.S. focus should shift to different regions and global challenges, and away from Europe, which is now seen as more stable than during the Cold War. There is also the concern that NATO could involve the U.S. in conflicts that are not in America's direct interest. Because of Article 5, an attack on one NATO member is considered an attack on all. This means the U.S. could be obligated to go to war to defend another NATO country, even if the U.S. itself was not directly threatened. Some worry about being drawn into conflicts that are more about European issues than American security. Furthermore, some people question if NATO allies would really defend the U.S. if it was attacked. Even though Article 5 has been invoked to support the U.S. after 9/11, some still doubt the commitment of other nations. They ask if European countries would truly come to the U.S.'s defense in a serious crisis. This uncertainty weakens the argument for the U.S. to remain so deeply involved in NATO, according to this viewpoint. In summary, arguments for the U.S. leaving or reducing its NATO role often center on financial costs. The idea of burden sharing, shifting U.S. priorities to other global areas, concerns about being drawn into unwanted conflicts, and doubts about the reliability of allies to defend the U.S. These arguments suggest that it might be better for the U.S. to focus on its own defense and interests and let Europe take more responsibility for its own security. 7. Arguments for U.S. staying. There are strong reasons why the United States should remain in NATO. Staying in the alliance is seen by many as important for both U.S. and global security. One key argument is that NATO helps to keep peace and stability in the Euro-Atlantic area. The U.S. presence in NATO acts as a deterrent. This means it discourages potential enemies from attacking NATO countries. If the U.S. were to leave, this deterrent effect might become weaker. This could lead to more instability and risk of conflict in Europe, which could also affect the United States. NATO is also a valuable platform for cooperation and diplomacy. It allows the U.S. to work with many allies on security issues. Through NATO, the U.S. can discuss and coordinate responses to global challenges. This includes issues like terrorism and cyber attacks, which are threats that affect all member countries, including the U.S. Working together in NATO allows for sharing of resources and ideas to address these threats more effectively than any nation could alone. Article 5 of the NATO Treaty is a central point in this argument. It states that an attack on one member is considered an attack on all. This principle of collective defense is a major reason why NATO is important. When the United States was attacked on the 11th of September, 2001, NATO invoked Article 5 for the first and only time in its history. This meant that all NATO allies stood with the U.S. and offered their support. This shows that the commitment is mutual. NATO is not just about the U.S. defending others, but also about allies being there for the U.S. when needed. Some argue that the U.S. might not be defended by its allies if it were attacked. However, history shows otherwise. After 9/11, NATO allies joined the U.S. in Afghanistan, demonstrating their commitment to collective defense. Leaders from other NATO countries have emphasized this loyalty and mutual support. For example, a leader of a key NATO ally stated that they are loyal and faithful allies and expect the same in return, recalling centuries of mutual support. Furthermore, NATO provides a framework for sharing the burdens of defense. While there have been discussions about fair burden sharing and some allies not meeting defense spending targets, NATO is actively working on this. Many allies are increasing their defense spending, and there is a collective goal for all to contribute more. The U.S. benefits from having allies who can share military responsibilities and contribute to common security goals. If the U.S. were to withdraw, it could lead to a situation where the U.S. has to bear more of the security burden alone, globally. In conclusion, arguments for the U.S. staying in NATO highlight the alliance's role in deterring aggression, fostering cooperation, and providing mutual security guarantees. NATO is seen as a valuable tool for the U.S. to maintain its security interests and promote global stability in partnership with its allies. 8. What might happen? The future of NATO is not certain. There are different ideas about what could happen in the coming years. One important question is the role of the United States. In the past, a U.S. president said he was not sure if NATO countries would help the U.S. if it was attacked. He also suggested that the U.S. might not defend NATO members who do not spend enough money on their defense. This raises questions about the future of the alliance. If the U.S. reduced its role in NATO, it could change the organization a lot. Some people think that European countries would need to take more responsibility for their own security. They might work more closely together on defense. If the U.S. changed its commitment, it could also affect global power. NATO is important for security in Europe and for relationships between countries in North America and Europe. If NATO became weaker, it could change how countries work together around the world. Some people believe that the U.S. will continue to see NATO as important for its own interests and for global stability. Others think that changes are possible, especially if disagreements about money and defense continue. It is hard to say exactly what will happen. Many things can influence the future of NATO, including political changes in member countries and new global challenges. The relationship between the U.S. and NATO is complex and will continue to be discussed and debated. The future shape of European security and NATO's role in it depends on many factors, and the situation remains uncertain.
Hey there! Just a second before you go. If you learned something new today, please give this video a like, write your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel. It only takes a second, and it really, really helps to create even better English videos for you. Your support means the world. Thank you.